Have you ever felt that strange tightness in your chest when you realize a financial decision just won't stay in the past? It comes back every month, not as an abstract thought, but as a fixed amount, a date on the calendar, an obligation that doesn't ask if you're feeling okay that day. It's not just a house. It's not just a mortgage. It's the silent feeling of being committed to something too big to ignore and too long to forget. There's a specific moment when this usually comes to light. It's not the day you sign the contract. On that day, everything seems perfect. You're excited, proud, surrounded by expectations. The problem comes later, when the routine begins. When the house becomes normal, but the debt remains enormous. When you realize that the choice doesn't end when the keys are in your hand. It only begins there. And then comes the question that almost no one asks out loud, but that many people think about alone, usually late at night. Now that I've already bought it, what do I do with the money that's left over? It's not a simple question. It's a question laden with fear, control, and the future, because you might be doing well. You pay the bills, fulfill your obligations, maybe you even got a promotion. For the first time in a long time, there's a little left over at the end of the month. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to change something, and that's exactly where the conflict begins. You look at your mortgage and it still seems enormous. The number barely moves. Every month you pay, and a large portion of the money simply disappears in interest. It's not intuitive, it's not visible, but it's real. At the same time, the whole world seems to be repeating the same message. Investing is the way to go. The market grows in the long term. Those who invest early go further. Those who don't invest fall behind. And suddenly you find yourself torn between two very different promises. On one hand, the promise of relief, paying off the debt faster, reducing the repayment period, cutting interest, having the feeling that you are regaining control, laying your head out, even if slowly. On the other hand, there's the promise of growth, putting money into the market, watching your assets increase, betting on time, on compound interest, on the idea that money can work for you instead of being stuck behind a wall. Both seem intelligent, both seem defensible, and both have costs that almost no one explains properly. This is the confusing part, because on paper, everything becomes a percentage, but in real life, everything becomes a feeling of security, a feeling of opportunity, a feeling of doing the right thing or of making a mistake in silence. And here's an uncomfortable truth. Most people don't suffer because they made a bad choice. They suffer because they made a choice that doesn't align with who they are. Some people can't relax knowing they owe hundreds of thousands of reais, even if the interest rates are good. For these people, debt occupies mental space. It steals energy. It becomes constant noise. For them, paying off the debt isn't just a financial decision. It's an emotional one. Other people feel the opposite. They become distressed seeing all their money tied up in the house. They feel stuck, that they've lost flexibility, that if something happens, they have no liquidity. For these people, investing brings calm. It brings options. It brings a sense of movement. None of these people are wrong, but many people try to live as if they were the other. Now, imagine a common scene. It's the middle of the night. You wake up for no clear reason. You look at the clock. 3 in the morning. Your body is tired, but your mind starts working on its own. And the first thing that comes to mind isn't a concrete problem. It's a calculation. If I put more money into the mortgage, how much time will I have left? But what if the market goes up sharply? What if I'm throwing money away? What if I'm losing years? This internal dialogue doesn't happen because you're anxious. It happens because the decision hasn't been resolved within you. There's an important point here. Something that completely changes how people view mortgages, but which is almost never clearly explained. Most people believe that by paying an installment, they are buying a piece of the house, as if each payment were a small, visible advance. But in the first few years, this isn't true. Most of what you pay doesn't buy the house. It buys interest. It buys time. It buys the right to continue owing. This creates a huge psychological distortion. You feel like you're doing everything right, but the balance doesn't seem to react. And this feeling of effort without progress is one of the strongest triggers of financial frustration. So let's bring this to a real-world scenario, without fantasy and without manipulated numbers. You bought a house. You took out a 3-year mortgage. The loan amount is $500,000. The interest rate is 7% per year. The monthly payment, just principal and interest, is around $3,327. We're not talking about taxes, insurance, or extra fees, just the basics, just what's already a significant expense. You pay on time for an entire year. You don't fall behind. You don't fail. You do exactly what the system expects of you, and then something positive happens. Your income increases. Maybe a promotion, maybe a new project, maybe a career change. The fact is, a new space opens up in your budget, an extra $1,000 per month. This money may seem small compared to the size of the debt, but it is enormous compared to the decision-making power it carries. Because now you can do two radically different things with it. You can use that money to pay off the mortgage. Put it all down towards the principal. Try to shorten the path. The logic is straightforward. Less debt, less interest, less time tied up. It's the promise of future relief in exchange for giving up possibilities now. Or you can invest. Put that money into the market, month after month. Trust that, in the long run, the returns will pay off. The logic is also clear. Instead of burying money in debt, you plant something that can grow and multiply. And here's a question that almost no one honestly asks themselves. Which of these decisions can you stick to when things don't go as planned? Because investing requires a strong stomach. The market doesn't go up in a straight line. There will be downturns, bad periods, scary headlines. Can you keep investing when it seems like everything is going wrong? Or will you give up at the worst possible moment? And paying off debt also requires maturity, because you might get to the future and think, if I had invested, maybe I would have more money today. Can you live with that doubt without regretting it every day? Do you realize that the problem isn't just financial? It's behavioral. It's psychological. And there's another detail that almost no one mentions. Investing gives a feeling of constant progress. You see numbers changing. You see graphs. Amortization doesn't. Amortization is silent. The benefit is real, but it's not visible in everyday life. This makes many people underestimate the impact of reducing expensive debt, even when the numbers justify it. It's important to make something very clear here. There is no single answer. Anyone who promises a universal answer is selling intellectual comfort, not reality. What exists is a decision-making process that needs to take numbers into account, yes, but also who you are, how you react to risk, and what brings you peace. And before we get into the calculations, there's an invisible enemy you need to understand, because it dominates this entire discussion. The way mortgages distribute your payments over time. That's what makes people feel like they're walking on quicksand. So let me challenge you with something simple, yet powerful. If I told you that after 12 installments of over $3,300, you may have sent almost $40,000 to the bank, and even then your debt may have decreased much less than you imagine, would you believe it? Most people don't believe it. It seems exaggerated. It seems like a miscalculation. It seems too unfair to be real. But it's real. And when you understand this mechanism, everything changes. You begin to see why amortizing seems so liberating for some, and why investing seems so urgent for others. For now, hold on to that tension. You have a large debt, a significant interest rate, and some extra cash on hand. One option promises you security. The other promises you potential. And both come at a price that isn't reflected in the installment payment. In the next part, we're going to open this mortgage black box and look, with real numbers, at where your money actually goes in the first few years. And when you see this clearly, the question will no longer be, what do I do with $1,000 a month? But what am I really paying every time I make this transfer? When people think about that extra money at the end of the month, the first image that almost always comes to mind is investing, not a mortgage. Investing has a better narrative. It seems modern, smart, aligned with everything that's being said about the future. It's easy to imagine investing. It's hard to imagine paying off debt. And this doesn't happen by chance. Investing is movement. It is history. It is expectations. You imagine your money growing, multiplying, opening doors. A mortgage, on the other hand, is static. It's always the same large number, always there, always demanding payment. It doesn't inspire, it demands. So let's get inside the head of an ordinary person. Maybe you, maybe someone very similar to you. This person just earned an extra $1,000 a month. It wasn't luck, it was effort. Over time, greater responsibility, more pressure. This money has emotional value. It represents progress. And nobody wants to use progress to plug a hole. Nobody likes the feeling of working harder just to stay in the same place. That's why the idea of investing seems so natural. You think, if I throw this money into the market, it will work for me. I'm not just going to put out fires. I'm going to build something. So you do what seems logical. You open an account with a brokerage firm. You choose a simple index fund, nothing fancy. Something that represents the market as a whole. You set up an automatic investment every month without thinking, a system. You feel organized, financially mature, and then comes the comfort of historical numbers. You read that in the long term, the American market yielded close to 10% per year. Not every year, of course, but on average. To be more prudent, you reduce that expectation to 9%. You feel responsible. You're not counting on a miracle, and you still think, my income will grow over time. So you decide to increase that contribution little by little, maybe 3% per year, keeping pace with your professional development. Everything seems reasonable. Everything seems under control. Now, imagine this routine repeating itself month after month. You work, you get paid, you invest. You work, you get paid, you invest. There's no strong emotion at the beginning. It's even a bit boring. But over time you start looking at the balance. It goes up. Sometimes it goes down. Then it goes up again. And that creates something powerful. The feeling of visible progress. You mention it to someone, not to brag, but because you're excited. Dude, I've started investing properly. The person responds positively. You feel like you're part of a group that gets the hang of the game. And when you run the numbers over the long term, the result is almost hypnotic. Investing $1,000 a month, adjusting that amount over the years, with an average rate of 9%. The final number, after almost 3 decades, easily surpasses 1 million. It surpasses 1.5 million. It gets close to 2. This number changes everything. It changes how you see yourself. It changes how you imagine the future. It becomes retirement. It becomes freedom. It becomes the possibility of working because you want to, not because you need to. And then a silent but dangerous question arises. Why would I put that money into debt when it could turn into all of this? At this point, many people close the discussion. They decide that investing is obviously superior, that amortization is something for conservative, fearful, or ill-informed people. The spreadsheet seems clear. The logic seems sound. But there's one detail that almost never factors into this emotional equation. Investing is a statistical promise, not a contract. The market owes you nothing. It doesn't know when you started. It doesn't know when you need it. It doesn't care about your plans. And yet, most people make a silent assumption that good results will appear in a reasonable way, not too early, not too late, as if the market had a built-in sense of justice. Now, imagine another everyday scene. A couple sitting at the kitchen table on any given evening. One of them looks at their cell phone and comments, "The market fell today." It's not panic. It's just a comment. The other replies, "That's okay. It's a long-term thing." They repeat this several times over the years. And, most of the time, it works. But what if it doesn't work for a long time? Here's an interesting fact that almost no one truly grasps. Two people can invest the exact same amount of money for the same total time in the same market, and end up with completely different results. Not because one was smarter, but because they started at different times. This isn't theory. It happens all the time. Imagine someone who started investing shortly before a major crisis. This person invests consistently for years, without fail. But the first few years are tough. Money comes in when the market crashes. The balance takes a long time to recover. Psychologically, this is difficult. You do everything right, but the results don't appear. Now, think about someone who started right after a big setback. The first few years are great. Their profits grow quickly. This person builds confidence. They believe that investing is easy, that the market always rewards discipline. Both people did the same thing, but they lived through completely different emotional experiences. And this matters a lot, because financial decisions aren't made once. They're sustained over time. And what makes you sustain a decision isn't the historical average. It's how you feel during bad times. Meanwhile, the mortgage remains. Every month, the payment comes due. Every month, the debt decreases a little. It doesn't matter if the market crashed. It doesn't matter if there was a crisis. It doesn't matter if the news is bad. The rate is the same. The contract is the same. And here begins a silent contrast that few people notice. While investment is uncertain in the short and medium term, a mortgage is predictable. It won't surprise you positively, but it won't scare you either. It's stable, and stability has psychological value. But there's another, even more uncomfortable point that often goes unnoticed when people choose to invest instead of paying down the mortgage. While you invest expecting an average return of 9%, you're paying a guaranteed interest rate on the mortgage. In our example, 7%. This means that every month there is a constant leak of money leaving your life with zero return for you. Interest paid doesn't come back. It doesn't turn into assets. It doesn't grow over time. It simply disappears. And here's where the mind starts to freeze. Because now you're not comparing investing versus amortizing. You're comparing an expected return against a guaranteed cost. But even so, investing still seems better. Because the final number is higher. Because the graph is prettier. Because the story is more exciting. Until you ask yourself a simple yet profound question. What happens if I get the timing wrong? Because nobody chooses when crises happen. Nobody chooses when the market enters a bad period. And nobody chooses when they need the money. These things simply happen. And here's the key point of this part of the story. Investing works very well when time is on your side, but it requires something that few people account for correctly: emotional resilience. The ability to keep doing the right thing when it seems wrong. Some people have it. Others don't. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with personality, life context, responsibilities, and stress levels. Meanwhile, the mortgage has another curious psychological effect. It bothers you. It weighs you down. It shows up every month. And precisely for that reason, when you begin to understand how it works from the inside, something changes. The debt ceases to be an abstract number and becomes a system that can be attacked. To do that, you need to see how the mortgage works. You need to understand where the money goes, especially in the beginning. Because the feeling of paying but not making progress isn't just your imagination. It's math. And here comes the surprise that often shatters the confidence of those who have never looked at this closely. Most people believe that by paying 12 large installments, the balance decreases proportionally, that paying a lot means owing much less. In practice, this almost never happens in the first few years. So, hold on to this image for a moment longer. On one hand, investing promises growth, but requires patience, a strong stomach, and luck with timing. On the other hand, a mortgage seems static, burdensome, and ungrateful, but operates with fixed and predictable rules. In the next part, we're going to open up an actual spreadsheet for a typical mortgage and look, month by month, at where your money actually goes at the start of the contract. And when you see that breakdown clearly, maybe you'll understand why so many people feel like they're running without getting anywhere. There comes a moment when it all clicks. It doesn't happen when you sign the contract. It doesn't happen when you make the first payment. It happens when you stop, breathe, and decide to look at the numbers without rushing, without pretty narratives, without embedded hope. Just the numbers as they are. Imagine you decide to do something simple. Check your mortgage statement after a year. 12 payments made. 12 large installments. Enough money to buy a good car outright. You log into your bank app expecting to see reasonable progress. Something that confirms your feeling of hard work. And then you see the balance. It did decrease, yes, but much less than your intuition expected. At this point, many people think they're misinterpreting it. Close the popping it again. Check the number, because the brain doesn't like this information. It creates a direct conflict between perceived effort and real progress. Now, tell me something. If you worked for a whole year, paid over $30,000 in installments, and the debt barely budges, what exactly did you buy with that money? This is the question that almost no one asks, because the answer is unsettling. The structure of a mortgage is not intuitive. It's pure mathematics, but presented in a way that the human brain doesn't process well. At the beginning of the contract, you're not paying for the house. You're paying the cost of borrowing money. The house only starts to be truly bought much later. Let's take this out of the abstract. Imagine a loan of $500,000 with an interest rate of 7% per year. Over 30 years sounds simple, but what this means in practice is that, right from the start, interest is calculated on a huge amount. And since interest is proportional to the outstanding balance, it eats up most of the payment. In the first month of a payment of just over 3,300 reals, almost 2,900 reals goes to interest alone. Less than 500 reals reduces the debt. This is not an exception. It's the rule. In the second month, almost the same thing. In the third, too. The pattern repeats itself with a slowness that borders on cruel. Now, think about the psychological impact of this. You pay, but you don't feel any progress. You do everything right, but the feeling is that you're standing still. This creates frustration, even in organized and disciplined people. And here's an important pattern break. If someone offered you an investment where you'd put in 3,300 per month, but only 400 would actually go towards your net worth, would you accept? Probably not. But that's exactly what happens at the beginning of a mortgage. The bank doesn't hide this. It's all in the contract. It's all in the tables. The problem is that almost nobody looks at it, and even those who do look don't feel the impact until they experience it firsthand. After a year, you may have paid something around 39,000. Of that, only about 4,000 resulted in a real reduction of the debt. The rest evaporated as interest. It didn't come back to you. It didn't generate an asset. It didn't become a future option. It just went away. Now pause again and answer honestly. Knowing this, does the mortgage still seem like a neutral thing, or is it starting to look like a system that works against your perception of progress? This is where some people go into defensive mode. They say, but that's just how it is. It's the cost of owning a home. And yes, that's true. There's no such thing as a mortgage without interest. But accepting something doesn't mean you can't understand how it works and decide how to react. Because when you understand this mechanism, you realize something fundamental. Time works against you at the beginning and in your favor at the end, and that completely changes the strategy. In the early years, every extra real invested in the principal has a disproportionately large impact. It not only reduces the debt, but also reduces all future interest that would be calculated on that amount. It's like cutting the root instead of pruning the leaf. This is what almost no one realizes when discussing investing versus amortizing superficially. It's not just about percentage return. It's about where each dollar makes the biggest difference at each stage of the loan's life. Now, an uncomfortable question. If you know you're mainly paying interest in the first few years, does it make sense to continue treating that period as neutral while all the extra money goes into foreign investments? There is no universal answer. But there is a mathematical reality that needs to be considered. When you invest, you're dealing with expectation. When you make a down payment on a mortgage, you're dealing with certainty. Every dollar paid down eliminates future interest you would definitely pay. And here's an interesting point that rarely comes up in online discussions. Paying off a mortgage early is not the same as paying it off at the end. The impact is completely different. An extra payment in the first year can save several times that amount in interest over the following decades. The same payment made in year 20 has a much smaller effect. This creates a powerful asymmetry. Money has more strength against mortgage sooner rather than later. Now, imagine someone who completely ignores this. This person invests all their extra money for 10, 15 years, while paying only the minimum mortgage payment. The investment might even grow well. But at the same time, the mortgage continues to silently siphon off enormous interest. By the time this person realizes it, the most effective phase for tackling the debt is already past. The time that would make the biggest difference is gone. And here, another important question arises. How many bad financial decisions happen because people only look at the final cost and not the journey? The journey matters. The flow matters. The timing matters. Another point that is rarely discussed is the emotional effect of amortization at the beginning. When you start seeing your balance decrease faster than expected, something changes. Your relationship with the debt changes. It stops being a fixed monster and becomes something that reacts to your actions. This creates motivation. It creates a sense of control. And control has real psychological value. But there's also the other side. For some people, putting money into a mortgage creates a strange feeling of loss, of flexibility. It's as if the money disappears inside the house. You don't see it. You don't access it. You can't move it around. And here's another break from the norm. Would you rather have more money in the future or more options in the present? This question seems simple, but the answer changes everything. Because amortizing trades liquidity for risk reduction. Investing trades security for potential. None of these exchanges are free. The biggest mistake is treating this decision as purely mathematical, ignoring human behavior. People don't live like spreadsheets. They live like stories. And stories have fear, tiredness, euphoria, and regret. When you understand how a mortgage works from the inside, you realize it's not just a debt. It's a system that rewards certain behaviors and penalizes others. Ignoring this is like playing a game without knowing the rules. And here's the key point of this part. The feeling of paying and not anywhere isn't psychological. It's structural. It was designed that way. Now that we know this, the decision takes on a different tone. It's no longer investing is better than amortizing or amortizing is better than investing. The correct question begins to take shape in a different way. The question then becomes, at what point in my financial life does every reel make the biggest difference? Because perhaps investing makes more sense at certain stages and amortizing at others. Maybe the mistake lies in trying to choose a single answer to a problem that changes over time. And before you think this ends here, let me prepare you for the next shock, because understanding amortization is only half the story. The other half involves something that seems simple, but completely changes the game. What happens when the mortgage is paid off early? When you pay off a large debt, you don't just gain emotional relief, you gain cash flow. And cash flow changes strategies, changes possibilities, and changes the future. In the next part, we're going to take this understanding of amortization and push it to the limit. We'll see what really happens when someone decides to aggressively attack their mortgage, how much time it cuts, how much money it saves, and why. Even so, the answer isn't as obvious as it seems at first glance. Once someone understands how amortization really works, something changes internally. The mortgage ceases to be an abstract number and becomes a predictable, almost mechanical system. And when a system is predictable, it can be exploited. This is where the idea of aggressive amortization comes in, that decision that, for many, seems too radical, until the numbers start to speak for themselves. Imagine an ordinary person, nothing out of the ordinary. Same mortgage of $500,000, same 7% interest rate, same monthly payment of just over $3,300. Nothing changes in the contract. The only difference is a conscious decision every month, in addition to the mandatory payment. This person decides to put another $1,000 directly towards the principal. No glamour, no advertising, just consistency. At first, the effect doesn't seem so impressive. The balance is still large. The number is still frightening, but something important is already happening beneath the surface. Each extra payment isn't just reducing the debt, it's removing future interest that will never exist again. This detail goes unnoticed by most people, but it's crucial. When you amortize, you don't just save in the current month, you save in all the following months. It's a silent chain reaction. Now let's put this into perspective. A 30-year mortgage wasn't designed to be paid off in 30 years. It was designed to extract as much interest as possible over time. Banks don't profit from houses. They profit from time. And the longer you spend paying interest on a large balance, the more money drains away. Market data shows that in traditional 30-year mortgages, the total amount paid in interest can easily exceed the original value of the property. In many cases, you buy $1,000 house for over $700,000 in interest alone over the life of the loan. This is not an exception. It's the norm. Now pause here for a second and answer this mentally. If someone told you there was a legal, simple, and risk-free way to cut hundreds of thousands from that cost, would you ignore it? When the extra amortization comes into play, the impact is almost shocking. By adding $1,000 per month to the principal, adjusting that amount slightly over time to match income, that 30-year mortgage ceases to exist in just over 16 years. That's not an exaggeration. That's almost 14 years, cut from the contract. And here's something curious. When people hear this, many doubt it. They think there's some hidden trick, that it only works for those who earn a lot. But that's not it. It works because the compound interest system works against you when you owe money, and in your favor when you pay off the debt early. There's a little-known fact. Over 70% of all interest on a 30-year mortgage is paid in the first half of the contract. This means that the initial years hold the greatest potential for savings. And that's precisely where extra amortization is most powerful. Now consider a realistic scenario. A couple decides to aggressively amortize their finances in the first few years because they are both working, have no children yet, and have a stable income. They tighten their budget a bit, forgo some trips, and make conscious choices. They don't live badly, but they live with intention. 16 years later, the house is paid off, not because they won the lottery, not because they received an inheritance, but because they used time as an ally. While friends are still looking at another decade of installments, they wake up in a specific month and realize they no longer need to pay the mortgage. This moment is often described as strange. It's not immediate euphoria, it's silence. It's the absence of an obligation that was always there, and only then does it dawn on you. Every month, now, there's a significant amount of money that simply doesn't need to be taken out of the account anymore. And here comes an unexpected fact that changes the tone of the discussion. When you pay off your mortgage early, you don't just gain peace of mind, you gain cash flow. In our example, this means freeing up more than $4,000 per month, considering the original payment plus the extra amount that was being amortized. This money didn't appear out of thin air. It already existed. The difference is that before it was being drained by interest, now it's free. And this creates a completely different scenario from what people imagine when they say paying back debt is throwing money away. It's not the end of the game. It's a phased transition. But before we get to the good part, there's a necessary shock. To save around $380,000 in interest, this person had to spend extra money along the way, approximately $238,000 in additional amortizations. This is the moment when many critics point the finger and say, "See, it wasn't worth it. You spent almost $250,000 to save $380,000. The real gain is much smaller." And they are partly right. The direct net savings are around $140,000. That's not a small amount, but it's also not a number that, on its own, ends the discussion. Now comes the question that is almost never asked. What is worth more, $140,000 in guaranteed savings, or the possibility of a higher, but uncertain, return in the market? This question isn't technical, it's existential, because aggressive amortization doesn't just compete with investment. It competes with anxiety, with the fear of losing income, with the feeling of vulnerability. For many people, reducing fixed obligations is a form of emotional protection. There's an interesting finding in financial well-being studies. People with less fixed debt report significantly lower stress levels, even when they have less total net worth. This goes against purely mathematical logic, but it makes sense when you understand the psychological weight of monthly obligations. Now, imagine weathering an economic crisis without a mortgage. While others are desperate to keep up with high payments, you have leeway, you have options. You can take a different job. You can reduce your hours. You can breathe easier. This doesn't show up on the return spreadsheet, but it shows up in life. On the other hand, it's also true that paying everything off too early can lead to regret for those who value liquidity and growth. Seeing friends with large investments while your assets are stuck in your house can create a feeling of missed opportunity. And this is where the narrative gets interesting, because it stops being right versus wrong and becomes cost versus benefit in different dimensions. Aggressive amortization is predictable. It doesn't surprise you in a positive way, but it doesn't disappoint either. It delivers exactly what it promises. Less debt, less interest, less time tied up. And this creates a solid foundation. A foundation that can later be used to invest much more aggressively. But before reaching that conclusion, we need to make an honest comparison, because so far we've seen the power of cutting interest and time. What remains to be understood is what happens after the mortgage ends and the money starts working in another direction. Most people view amortization as if it were the end, as if paying off the house were the final chapter. In reality, it's only the middle of the story. The real impact appears when that freed up monthly cash flow starts to be invested. When the person who previously paid off the debt begins to invest much larger amounts than they could have at the beginning of the journey. That's where the comparison gets tough. And that's where the answer ceases to be obvious. In the next part, we'll put the two complete trajectories side by side. Investing from the beginning versus amortizing first and investing later. We'll look at the final numbers, yes, but also at the path, the risk, and the invisible differences between these choices. And when you see the full results, you might realize that the question was never which strategy makes the most money, but which strategy can I sustain without going bankrupt along the way. There comes a point when the two stories finally meet. Up until now, they seem to run on parallel tracks. On one side, the person who invested from the beginning, trusting in time and market growth. On the other, the person who decided to attack the mortgage head-on, reducing years of debt and aggressively cutting interest rates. But now comes the point where the comparison ceases to be theoretical and becomes practical. This happens on the day the mortgage ends. It's not a day celebrated with fireworks. Most of the time, nobody notices except the person paying. The installment simply stops being debited from the account. The bank app shows zero. And, for the first time in many years, that monthly payment ceases to be an obligation. Now stop and think about the real impact of this. Not just in emotional terms, but in strategic terms. For more than a decade, this person got used to living without that money. It had become part of the budget as something unavailable, and suddenly it's back in full. In our scenario, this means more than $4,000 per month in free income every single month. It's not a bonus. It's not uncertain extra income. It's a steady stream that used to feed interest and can now fuel choices. And this is where many people make the mistake of comparing, because they tend to only look at what was lost when paying off the debt. Little is said about what becomes possible afterward. Now, imagine this person deciding to invest all that money as soon as the mortgage is paid off. Not $1,000 a month, not $500. More than $4,000 for consecutive years. With discipline, with the same automatic logic that was previously used to pay off the debt. This scenario often surprises even the most rational people because growth accelerates at this stage. The time remaining until the 30-year mark is still enough to generate significant wealth, not as large as that of someone who invested from the beginning, but much larger than most imagine. When the numbers are put side by side, the result is unsettling for those who prefer simple answers. The strategy of investing from the beginning still ends up with more money. The difference isn't small, but it's not absurd either. Something around a few tens of thousands, not hundreds. And then the inevitable question arises. Was all the effort of paying down the loan worth it, only to end up with less money? This question seems straightforward, but it hides another, much more important one. What risk was taken along each path? Because up until now, we've been talking about final values as if they were guaranteed. But they aren't, especially when it comes to pure investment. Here enters a concept that completely changes the interpretation of this confrontation: the risk of a series of returns. The market doesn't deliver averages. It delivers years, some great, some eternal, and the order in which those years appear matters more than the average in the long run, especially when you're investing monthly. Two people can invest exactly the same amount for the same total period and end up in completely different places. Not because one was smarter, but because they started at different points in the economic cycle. Someone who starts investing shortly before a major crash spends years putting money into a market that doesn't react. Psychologically, this is exhausting. You do everything right and see no reward. Many give up at that point. Another person starts right after a big drop and sees quick results. They build confidence. They keep investing. The two strategies were identical. The emotional outcome was the opposite. Now, compare that to amortization. There's no sequence of returns. There's no volatility. Every real invested there generates exactly the same effect. A guaranteed return equal to the debt rate. In our example, 7%. Exactly. No surprise. No headlines. No panic. This doesn't mean that amortizing wins against the market. It means that it plays a different game. And here comes another factor that is almost always ignored: taxes. When you invest and accumulate wealth, a portion of that gain isn't yours. The moment you sell, you pay tax on the profit, even with favorable tax rates. This reduces the net return. Money saved through interest, however, isn't taxed. It simply doesn't leave your life. This detail, in isolation, doesn't change everything. But when added to the risk, volatility, and human behavior, it starts to weigh heavily. Now, imagine an extreme yet realistic scenario: a prolonged crisis, a sharp market downturn in the early years of your investment journey. You continue investing, but your balance doesn't improve. At the same time, your mortgage continues to suck in high interest payments every month. Can you handle it? This isn't a theoretical question. It's a behavioral one. Most people don't abandon a plan when everything is going well. They abandon it when everything is going wrong, and this is where the comparison changes level. It's no longer about maximizing the bottom line in a perfect spreadsheet. It's about choosing a strategy you can maintain for decades, even when life goes off script. For some people, the predictability of amortization acts as an emotional anchor. It reduces anxiety. It creates a sense of real progress. And this allows these people to invest with much more peace of mind later on because they don't carry the burden of debt. For others, liquidity and the potential growth of the investment are essential. These people tolerate volatility better. They aren't scared by downturns. They don't lose sleep over good debt. For them, investing from the start makes more sense. None of these approaches is superior in all dimensions. Each optimizes something different. The strategy of investing everything optimizes expected final equity. The strategy of amortizing first optimizes security, predictability, and future cash flow. And the cost of choosing one is giving up part of the other. The most common mistake is pretending that this cost doesn't exist. When you choose to invest everything, you accept more risk and more uncertainty in exchange for potential. When you choose to aggressively amortize, You accept a lower expected financial return in exchange for stability. The problem isn't choosing. The problem is choosing without knowing what you're sacrificing. And here a different idea begins to emerge. What if the answer isn't in extremes? What if the conflict exists precisely because we are trying to solve a human problem with a binary solution? Because, in practice, few people live only on one side or only on the other. Most oscillate. They change phases. They change priorities. Perhaps the mistake lies in asking which is better, instead of asking how to intelligently balance this over time. In the next part, this question finally takes shape. We'll talk about an approach that doesn't try to beat the market or destroy debt all at once, but to create progressive freedom. A way to divide the effort, reduce risks, and align mathematics with human behavior. Because, in the end, the best financial plan isn't the one that maximizes a number. It's the one you can follow without sabotaging yourself. After everything you've seen so far, perhaps the question is no longer which strategy makes the most money. Perhaps it has silently shifted to something more honest and harder to answer. Which strategy can I live with without betraying myself along the way? Because, at its core, money has never been just money. It's condensed time. It's energy. It's choice. It's the reflection of the priorities you carry when no one is watching. Throughout this video, you saw real numbers, possible scenarios, and honest comparisons. You saw that investing from the beginning tends to generate more wealth on paper. You saw that aggressively amortizing reduces risk, interest, and anxiety in a concrete way. You saw that each path demands a different price. And now comes the most important moment of all, transforming understanding into action, not an impulsive action, not a decision made in the heat of the moment, but a simple, clear, and actionable plan that you can sustain even when the initial excitement fades. The first step is to stop treating this decision as a war between right and wrong. It isn't. It's a choice of alignment. So, before tinkering with any numbers, do something almost no one does right at home. Grab a piece of paper or a note on your phone and answer, with brutal honesty, 3 questions. First, what keeps me up at night today regarding money? It's not what should be taken away. It's what actually is taken away. Debt, lack of assets, fear of instability, feeling stuck. Second, in a scenario of personal or professional crisis, what would give me the most peace of mind? More money invested, even with volatility, or fewer fixed monthly obligations? Third, which mistake could I tolerate best in 20 years? Looking back and thinking I could have invested more or thinking I could have paid it off sooner. These answers aren't universal. They're yours, and they matter more than any spreadsheet. Now, with that in mind, comes the practical plan. Simple. No financial heroics. Step 1. Secure the basics. Before discussing mortgage versus investment, have a real emergency fund, something between 6 and 12 months of essential expenses. Without it, any strategy becomes fragile. Liquidity is not a luxury. It's protection. Step 2. Respect easy and cheap money. If you have access to clear benefits, such as company-provided retirement matching or obvious tax incentives, use those first. Ignoring easy money is a silent mistake. Step 3. Look at your mortgage rate without emotion. Don't treat the interest rate as a detail. It's the heart of the decision. The higher the rate, the more powerful the amortization. The lower the rate, the more competitive the investment. If the rate is somewhere in the middle, accept that the middle ground might be the smartest answer. Step 4. Choose a conscious division. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can split the extra money. 50/50, 60/40, 70/30 numbers list. Choose a ratio that will keep you going even in tough months. Step 5. Automate and stop renegotiating with yourself every month. The biggest source of financial error isn't lack of information. It's repeated decisions. Automate amortization. Automate investment. Remove emotion from execution. Emotion has already been used in the choice. Step 6. Review, but don't obsess. Once a year, review the plan. See if anything has changed in your life, your income, or your stress level. adjust if necessary. But don't keep jumping from strategy to strategy with every headline or new video. And here comes the essence of the so-called F to rule, the Freedom Fund. It's not a rigid mathematical formula. It's a practical philosophy. The idea is that financial freedom doesn't stem from a single final number, but from the combination of assets, cash flow, and peace of mind. For some people, this freedom comes faster by reducing debt. For others, it comes by building assets. For many, it comes by doing both at the same time. What doesn't work is living in constant conflict with your own decisions. What doesn't work is copying the strategy of someone who sleeps soundly despite things that make you anxious. What doesn't work is pursuing a perfect financial outcome at the cost of an emotionally unsustainable life. There's a simple scene that sums it all up. Two people live in similar houses, earn similar amounts of money, and live similar lives. One feels safe, the other feels trapped. The difference isn't in the contract. It's in the internal narrative. And the internal narrative doesn't change with more information. It changes with coherent decisions. Therefore, the final invitation is not for you to choose between investing or amortizing. It's for you to choose intentionality, to choose to stop acting automatically, to choose to stop putting off this decision until later, to choose a plan that you can calmly explain to yourself. If you've made it this far, it's because this issue matters to you. And if it matters, it deserves attention, not haste. So do this. Today, even today, define a simple rule for your extra money. Write that rule down and start. Even if it's small, even if it's imperfect, consistent movement beats a brilliant, abandoned strategy. If this video helped you see this decision more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. That shows me that this type of content makes sense to you. If you can like the video, because that really helps the channel reach more people who are exactly in this silent dilemma. And if you want, leave a comment describing your situation or your question. You don't need to expose yourself. You can remain anonymous. This is a space for real conversation, not judgment. Many people are going through the same conflict, even if they don't talk about it out loud. Ultimately, there isn't one right answer for everyone. There's your answer. And when it's built with clarity, information, and honesty, it tends to be good enough, because money, when well spent, doesn't just buy things. It buys choices, and well-made choices buy freedom.